ancient times by Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, and Métis peoples. We're grateful for their hospitality, we're grateful for their fine stewardship of these lands, and we're grateful for Treaty 1, treaty made, created before the Creator God in 1871 between Indigenous and settler peoples. And also we're grateful for Treaty 3, where our clean, clear drinking water comes from. So in the commitment and the yearnings that we feel together, welcome this evening, and now welcome to Steve to take us into the evening as a whole.
Thank you. It's so nice to see so many of you out and so many friendly faces, familiar faces, and this is very, very encouraging. This is a collaborative event between CMU and St. Margaret's, and CMU has ongoing lectures, and this is sort of part of that. St. Margaret's and several other organizers are right now working on putting together what they're calling a consultation. You might think of it more like a conference. That's the words that we would normally use on climate change and political theology next September. They call it a consultation because it's sort of a deep dive into the tradition of the church regarding these issues. So it's consulting the tradition. So that's why it's not a conference, it's a consultation next September. So you all have a little thing on there. If you want to be let know any details of that, please give us your emails and your address and all the kind of stuff at that table afterward, and then we'll stay in touch with you about other events coming up, leading up to the consultation. Okay, Don will come back and say all that better than I did again at the end to remind you. But who doesn't want to start with a song? Okay, several apparently. Check. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that when I looked at my body of material, I couldn't find anything directly related to climate change and political theology. So the closest I could get to our speaker was a song that I wrote about 2 years ago, riffing off of a sermon he once preached. And I heard the sermon online, and then I ripped it off for a song. And then when I confessed it to him, he said it's okay, I was ripping off Augustine anyway. So there you go. Love is our way to God, for God is love. Oh, sorry, wrong lyric here. Sorry. I'm not getting paid, so I don't care. Love is our way to God, for God is love. Love is our way to God, for God is love. The wilderness road of shame is gone. The desert road of dislocation gone. The stony road of loneliness has now become a royal way, a highway home. Love is our way to God, for God is love. Love is our way to God, for God is love. And all who carry disappointment come, and you fear the fire of judgment come. And those who teach this royal way is not for some. Shame on you. Now lovers come, 'cause love is our way to God, for God is love. Love is our way to God, for God is love. Love is patient, love is kind. Love pays ill, no, never mind. Love refines the finest gold, the charity of saintly souls. left for us to do is love. If this alone be done, it is enough. And as we love the other, God abides in us. God unseen, but seen in love. Love is our way to God, for God is love. Love is our way to God, for God is love. Love is our way to God, for God is love. Love is our way to God, for God is love. All right. That's it. Thank you. So the evening is going to go fairly smoothly. There's not a lot of detail to it. David is going to come in and speak to us for a bit. And then Gordon Zerbe is going to respond. And then we'll take a little bit of time for question and answer. And after that, I'll sing a song and we'll go home. So that's how it's going to go. David, let me get my notes out here. Widdicombe is a priest in the Anglican Church of Canada and has been the rector of St. Margaret's Anglican Church in Winnipeg since 1992. He also holds a doctorate of philosophy and theology from Oxford University. David is passionate about congregational theological education, about political theology, and pastoral care. And David is the principal energy and inspiration behind St. Margaret's consultation on political theology of climate change scheduled for next September. So he's a major part of that. I'm not going to tell you what his talk is about. Just give me a minute to tell you what it isn't about, because that sort of takes some pressure off David. David's lecture is not a discussion about the science of climate change. He said, I'm not a scientist. Right? So that's not what it is. David's talk assumes climate change is here. It assumes that climate change is dangerous, that human activity is a key contributor, not the only one, of course, but key, that human beings still have agency. And therefore, for the church, climate change is both a moral and a pastoral issue. David.
First of all, a thank you to Canadian Mennonite University for the invitation to speak with you this evening. And I'm now about to say the most important thing that I'm going to say all evening, and that is how important Canadian Mennonite University is to the churches of this city and province, and indeed to the city and province as a whole. The men and women who had the vision to institute Canadian Mennonite University deserve all the praise and thanks that the church could possibly heap upon them. The faculty here over these last several years has been exemplary in its faithful Christian scholarship, and the administrative leadership has always been and continues to be superb. And as this crisis that we face deepens and becomes more real, the churches here are going to need Canadian Mennonite University more and more, as they will, I think, surely lean on you for advice, for counsel, for care, for visionary theological leadership. Thank you for being here. And now for the less important stuff. In 1609, the English poet John Donne wrote a poem that began, "What if this present were the world's last night?" The poem confronts us with the possibility that any moment might be the moment when we experience the annulment of time and confront the judgment of God. Now, on the 16th of March, 2012, using that line as her title, Mary Robinson, a leading climate activist and former president of Ireland, delivered the annual John Donne Lecture for Hartford College at the University of Oxford. "If we do not take action," she said, in conclusion, "we could indeed be facing into the world's last night." Yet, Despite her obvious respect for the great poet who gave her the title for her lecture, Robinson finds that John Donne cannot help her with the problem of climate change, since, she says, we must bear in mind that he was a product of his time. She does not think that a long-dead poet has anything helpful to say about the future. And that is where Robinson makes a fatal mistake. And that mistake will lead us into the 4 concepts in political theology that I want to discuss this evening. Before turning to those 4 points, however, let me offer an overview of the climate crisis in a theological context that preachers might find useful. So this is just an overview. I'll take a few minutes to give you an overview and then dive into the 4 concepts of political theology that I want you to think about tonight. But as an overview, the May-June issue of MIT Technology Review bears the title, Welcome to Climate Change. The editor tells us that the problem of climate change has no technological solution that can rescue us from what he calls our political stupidity, and that consequently, because we are losing the battle to mitigate the catastrophic magnitude of climate change, we must turn our attention to adaptation and suffering. Mitigation, adaptation, suffering. 3 things. Now, I'm a preacher. I cannot resist the number 3. So, let us roughly map these 3 ideas onto the 3 theological virtues of faith, love, and hope. And this might help us to get to grips with the question, in the church, how should we talk about climate change? Now again, this is just a brief overview before I dive into the meat of my lecture. But how should we talk in the church about climate change? First, let's talk about faith and mitigation. The question of mitigation encourages the preacher to ask what it is that needs to be mitigated. If faith in Jesus Christ is the gift that allows us to prove realities that cannot be seen, as the letter to the Hebrews says, then what does faith know of creation and its climate? To whom do they belong? How are they to be understood? And how do they dictate that we must live? What, in short, has God to do with the climate? Because in the coming years, this is going to become a vexatious and even more vexatious and tension-filled question. We will do well to remember the first article of the Barmen Declaration written in Germany in May of 1934. Jesus Christ, as he is attested to us in Holy Scripture, is the one word of God whom we have to hear and whom we have to trust and obey in life and death. Whatever the church does or says about climate change must be rooted in authentic faith in Jesus Christ as the incarnation of the eternal Logos of God. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Second, love and adaptation. If faith seeks to understand the hidden realities beneath the surface of human affairs, love is its working out in the practical agency of women and men who serve humanity in acts of mercy and political wisdom. Here, the church must provide all assistance to the many organizations, agencies, and individuals who are teaching us how to adapt our ways of life to an increasingly hostile climate on a planet of limited resources. It requires us to make deeper and more practical commitments to our neighborhoods. Especially, the church must afford the maximum amount of encouragement to the young people who are courageously and eloquently attempting to change the direction in which we are headed. Third, hope and suffering. In every age, the question of human suffering raises the question of what we can hope for and what our hope is founded on. Christian hope is not optimism, and it is therefore immune to pessimism. It is founded upon the promises of God vouchsafed to humankind in the bodily resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ. Christians await not the end of history, but rather the judgment of God and the renewal of this material creation. And here I will close this introductory section with a quotation from the Marxist literary critic Terry Eagleton. In his book called Radical Sacrifice, he writes, "It may well be the case that the stock exchange, along with cancer, research, mortgage applications, and beginner's lessons in ancient Greek, would all collapse were we to know that the world was about to end. But philosophers pay too little heed to the positive aspects of such a catastrophe. The historical document which most famously claims that the world is fast approaching its finale is the New Testament. But in its view, Eagleton says, the ethical implications of this belief are very different from having the stuffing knocked out of one's sense of value." Really? Preachers will need the support of this institution if they are to take the New Testament that seriously. Eagleton continues, "Viewing the world in the light of Judgment Day is what allows true value to become manifest. Since there is not time to engage in property deals or the marriage market, to decimate the rainforests or invade other nations' territories, all that matters is friendship and righteousness. The vision of the end of history liberates the self from the tyranny of temporality. Eternity is here and now." In contrast to the conventional misconception that what is at stake for religious faith is a limitless afterlife, rather, the central Christian event is not survival, but resurrection. Faith, hope, and love are one way in which preachers and congregations might organize their thinking when they ask, how shall we talk in the church about the climate crisis? Now I want to move on to the heart of my lecture, and I've entitled it Climate Change and a Conservative Canadian Political Theology. I'm going back here to the concept of faith. I'm beginning to ask, how would we work out a faith-oriented response to the problem of climate change? I'm not going to be doing a lot of biblical work for you in this talk. I'm going to leave that to the biblical scholars at CMU. I'm not a theologian. In fact, I'm not a scholar of any kind. It's just that I know quirky little bits of history. And so I want to share some of them with you. I suspect you're going to find it irritating. But I want you to know, I'm hoping that you can get past the irritation and find that some of these ideas might be useful to incorporate into your own stance on the question of political theology and climate change. The conservative Canadian political theology that I speak from, that I grew up in on the Canadian prairies, of red Tory conservatism and Christian socialism, it has no chance of coming back. Don't worry. You do not be threatened by what I have to say. There isn't a hope of this ever being adopted as any kind of political policy. I'm merely going back to look at this tradition to see if there's some ideas in it that might still be useful. And that means that the target, kind of the talk is liberalism, and since we're almost all liberals, either right-wing or left-wing liberals, it is going to at times be irritating. So I'm warning you. So I want to turn to 4 ideas that were once central to a long-forgotten conservative tradition of political theology. 4 ideas that might still be useful to the church in this present crisis. These ideas might free your imagination to consider how we might live differently into the future, whatever that future turns out to be. This older Canadian tradition once stood prophetically against the right-wing liberalism of American republicanism, which we mistakenly call conservatism, just as it once stood against the aggressive individualism of American left-leaning liberalism. This tradition never really stood a chance to survive in the shadow of a great and prosperous empire. But as George Grant points out, the losers existed, I'm one of them, and they're worth reading now that we see what kind of society the winners have made. The 4 ideas I want to sketch for you tonight are as follows. First, for this older tradition of political thought, the past was valued over the ideology of progress. Secondly, Government intervention was trusted more to protect the common good than the free market solutions of classical economics. Thirdly, in general, the commons were valued over private ownership. And fourthly, in particular, the common ownership of land was normative and its private ownership was not. First, then, we begin with the past versus the ideology of progress. In 1958, the conservative Canadian political philosopher George Grant delivered a series of lectures for CBC Radio, later published under the title Philosophy in the Mass Age. In Lecture 6, on the limits of progress, in 1958, he said, "The question must be in any intelligent mind whether man's domination of nature can lead to the end of human life on the planet, perhaps by the slow perversion of the processes of life." Now, George Grant held that the Canadian spirit was guided by two fundamental conservative convictions, the first of which was that the past must guide us on our way into the future. But, he argued, the progressive spirit of a technological capitalist society precludes such guidance. The ideology of progress is blinding us because if we are closing in on the pinnacle of human advancement, then the next best idea must necessarily be ahead, not behind us. By contrast to this modern view, Grant does not believe that essential political concepts evolve over time. Moderns think so, but that is a modern idea. It is perhaps the only modern idea, and it did not evolve slowly over time, and it is in fact mistaken. Now, in some complicated philosophical sense that I do not grasp, the notion that our ideas are better than those of the ancients is, according to Grant, a mental straitjacket imposed on political theory by a technological society. In some sense, this is what the machine does to our brains. But I can give you an example of how this works. Mary Robinson claimed in her lecture that John Donne cannot help us to understand how to respond to climate change because he was a product of his age. By calling a dead poet a product of his age, she declares herself to be a liberal thinker mired in late modern capitalism. A great poet and preacher is merely a product, a unit of production. More to the point, she implies that we can understand Donne better than he understood himself, that our perspective relativizes his, that we have progressed beyond that age and place to a universal perspective, more true, better informed, broader in outlook than anything Donne could ever have imagined. Furthermore, she claims, modern medicine means that we do not have the same anxiety about early and unpredictable personal death that so vexed John Donne. And since the poet's personal death is what the poem is really about, the title notwithstanding, he can offer no wisdom for us moderns on the death of the world. But as you can see, there is a double irony here. Robinson wants to talk about the possible universal death of humanity, and that is what the first line of the poem announces. What if this present were the world's last night? Furthermore, thinking about that universal death of humanity will indeed cause a lot of personal agony about our own personal suffering and death. The anxiety level in my church is beginning to go up and up and up. The climate activist and the 17th century preacher here are talking about the same things. His first line says that he's concerned about what if this present were the world's last night, and then goes on to talk about facing his own personal death. These are exactly the things that concern Mary Robinson. Now, the fact that John Donne puts the emphasis in a slightly different place than Mary Robinson does might have been useful to her in her lecture. It's worth exploring. Why do they treat the problem in somewhat different ways? But no, According to the former President of Ireland, John Donne cannot help us. I have a great deal of respect for Mary Robinson, but I must point out that we are still reading John Donne after all these centuries. Mary Robinson once gave a lecture in Oxford that you've never heard of. According to Grant, this is exactly the problem of moderns. We do not know how to access the wisdom of the past, and the results are devastating. For example, although war, Grant says, has always been a part of the human experience, modern men have been exceptionally violent to other men, and he says other beings. And this is in part because we think that we are progressing toward a higher morality, and so we must necessarily deceive ourselves. We bear the terrible burden of being right, and the right must be protected no matter what the cost. We live on the right side of what we call the Enlightenment. We are more liberal, more democratic, freer and more affluent, more compassionate. But unable to admit that the way forward might be the way back, we may have progressed ourselves all the way to the eve of destruction. How did this happen? Modern liberalism, in Grant's view, in many ways began with the conquest of the North American continent, and he believed that it had reached some sort of full self-revelation in the war in Vietnam. Grant was disgusted with a Canadian government that refused to support the war in public, while in private encouraging Canadian businesses to profit from it. He was a pacifist. He joined student protesters in the streets, which is, I hope, what you are doing. In fact, he wrote an article explaining the ethical value of public demonstrations. In his mind, liberalism was as lethal as it was progressive, and had to be because it was rooted in a tradition of domination. As John Grenier, the professor of history at the U.S. Air Force Academy, makes clear in his book, The First Way of War, American War-Making on the Frontier, war waged against Indian non-combatants and agricultural resources came to define the way America fought her wars. In other words, our battle with and then mastery of the land of North America and its original inhabitants has left its mark on us. Lethal and compassionate, unbelievably prosperous and desperately short-sighted. These are marks of liberal modernity. Grant knew how difficult this was to resist. After all, the myth of progress, he says, does have roots in the biblical worldview. And the unquenchable thirst for ever greater affluence was driven by biblical compassion. More wealth meant better health care, higher education, more freedom. And freedom, Grant believed, was the essence of the liberal political doctrine, freedom of individual self-expression, even if that required of Canadians a degree of affluence that could only be sustained by assimilation into the continental economy of empire and the consequent loss of national independence. So, while the ineludible juggernaut of progress continued on to an ill-defined but unsustainable future, Grant continued his study of the ancients. What lessons from the past most interested him? Grant had gone to Oxford during the Second World War and would return there after the war to complete his D.Phil. He came under the influence of C.S. Lewis, a scholar of English literature who, believing that ancient books should be preferred over modern ones, had said that we all need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. Otherwise, he noted, young readers will be like the person who joins an 11 o'clock conversation that began at 8 and cannot understand what the fuss is about. The thing Lewis wrote that came most to define Grant's perspective is found in Lewis's famous book, Mere Christianity. Lewis writes, "The New Testament gives us a pretty clear hint of what a fully Christian society would be like. A Christian society would be leftist. We should feel that its economic life was very socialistic, but that its family life and code of manners were rather old-fashioned, perhaps even ceremonious and aristocratic. Furthermore, Lewis asserts, with respect to lending money at interest, the ancient Greeks, the Old Testament Jews, and the great teachers of the Middle Ages all forbade it. And this, he says, modernity has completely ignored. Now, George Grant must have taken this to heart. He returned to Canada, became a member of the Conservative Party of Canada, and sometimes wrote for and campaigned on behalf of the NDP. As he put it in his 1969 book, Technology and Empire, capitalism was the great dissolvent of the traditional virtues. It dissolved all ideas of the sacred, and it is, Grant says, destructive of all indigenous traditions. For Grant, tradition is our way to stay connected with older ways of life that still offer political wisdom for those seeking a sustainable way of life. But at the time, in the 1960s, few Canadians or Americans wanted to listen. As the contemporary Spanish novelist Javier Marias puts it in his sprawling masterpiece, Your Face Tomorrow, people today detest the past. The present era is so proud that it has produced a phenomenon which I imagine to be unprecedented: the present's resentment of the past. Resentment because the past had the audacity to happen without us being there. And even worse, without our gaining any advantage from it. The arrogance of our times has reached such proportions that it cannot admit the idea that things were better before. But remember that Grant had said that the Canadian spirit had a twofold conservative inspiration, and the second was trust in government over the marketplace. Grant believed that what marked the original Canadian experience over against the American was the conviction that public order, law, and authority should be used to curb excessive individualism and unregulated capitalism in order to protect and promote the common good. This separated him from C.S. Lewis, who seems not to have been interested in political theology. But when Grant returned to Canada, he had to come to terms with an older conservative tradition now lost in Britain, but still alive in Canada. This relates to the climate emergency because it reminds us that there was once a Canadian conservative tradition that argued that only national governments have the ability to promote the common good, and that marketplace solutions for major social problems can never work. Let us start with a present-day example. In his major work, Political Theology and Climate Change, the English theologian Michael Northcott makes the following argument. The creation of markets in carbon emissions trading reflects neoliberal prejudice against laws and taxes as means to modifying the behaviors of consumers and corporations. It also reflects the neoliberal description of the ideal society as one in which individuals realize their own good through maximal preference satisfaction via rational choice behaviors in competitive markets, rather than through cooperative and caring behaviors in families, neighborhoods, cities, and nations. In this stinging indictment, Northcott goes on to claim that most international climate agreements are anti-political instruments that remove the carbon problem from the realm of face-to-face debate, quote, in parliaments, law courts, local and community councils, churches, neighborhoods, and households. Instead, he says, the neoliberal idea is to keep ordinary people from understanding excessively convoluted, autonomous, mechanical markets in carbon trading, thus leaving these markets open to widespread corruption. Northcott believes that you're not supposed to understand what the hell is going on. Now, Northcott has a predecessor for this view in the Canadian humorist Stephen Leacock. Between 1915 and 1925, Leacock was the best-known English-speaking humorist in the world, known above all for his books Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town and Arcadian Adventures with the Idle Rich, perhaps the only book by a Western conservative ever officially published in the Soviet Union. Leacock was also longtime chair of the Department of Economics and Political Science at McGill. Like Grant, in religion he was a high church Anglican, and in politics he was a member of the Conservative Party and a friend of the Conservative Prime Minister R.B. Bennett. Like Grant, he believed that a healthy community needed strong civic institutions and a strong central government. Leacock wrote 2 books that are especially prophetic. In 1920, in the wake of the Winnipeg General Strike, he made a conservative case for a moderate welfare state in his book, The Riddle of Social Justice, and updated that argument in a book published in 1945, 1 year after his death, a book that carries the ominous title, While There Is Time, The Cure for Social Catastrophe. In the first book, Leacock argues that the invisible hand of the market does not, because it cannot, promote social justice. Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Thomas Malthus are spouting nonsense and promoting cruelty when they maintain that it does. The plight of the working class, he argues, has not improved because of the general increase in social wealth generated by capitalism. It has improved because of unions. And it will continue to improve only if Western governments will support unions and intervene in the marketplace to ensure that everyone that wants to work will have work. The marketplace, contrary to classical economics, will only ever generate an unjust wage and an unjust price. He also has Thomas Jefferson in his sights. The life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of the Declaration of Independence is fundamentally different than the peace, order, and good government of the British North America Act. And that difference resides at the heart of Leacock's red Tory conservatism. This Canadian affirmation offers a thick description of a flourishing human collective over against the individualistic liberal universalism of the American alternative, whether left or right. Although Leacock does not have the same ecological concerns as Grant does, his focus on the underlying question of economic justice is relevant. He argues that if unfettered free market capitalism is not checked by Western governments, then we will have been engaged in a slow march toward the abyss of social catastrophe, what he also calls a slow strangulation in a morass. And this was not said for rhetorical effect. As far as I can tell, Leacock really was worried about where the American commitment to liberty was taking us. The marketplace, he said, simply will not protect ordinary people. The idle rich, he said, ought to be made to do hard, honest work. Taxation, he insisted with gusto, is an awesome power and a great instrument for justice. In short, if not controlled by government, capitalism must necessarily lead to social consequences, he says, that no sane person should want to think about. As Grant put it in his 1969 book, Technology and Empire, as I've already said, capitalism was the great dissolvent of all the traditional virtues. It is destructive of all indigenous traditions. The agreement amongst Canadian conservatives was at one time that a relatively free market was an enormous benefit to humanity. When, but only when, national governments were willing to direct its outcomes toward the common good. Otherwise, free markets were bound to be insanely creative, energetic, and utterly amoral with immoral consequences. My suggestion tonight is merely this, that Northcott's point that national governments must pass legislation to keep fossil fuel in the ground is entirely consistent with the original Canadian conservative tradition that maintained that ordinary Canadians should never trust the marketplace to look after their best interests. The strong get stronger, Leacock insisted. The weak get sent to the wall. Laws and taxes, shout Grant and Leacock. Never to forget about the public necessity of laws and taxes. Public control, Grant argued, in the political and economic spheres is crucially important because, quote, no small country can depend for its existence on the loyalty of its capitalists, because capital necessarily migrates to the center of empire. Power attracts wealth. To survive as Canadians, argues Grant, and now even to survive as humanity, requires either a socialist or a conservative social policy that wisely restricts individual freedom for the sake of the general good. By the 1960s, Grant had gloomily concluded that such restriction will itself appear to be disastrous, but without it, we will be forced to think the unthinkable. Grant had more or less, it seems to me, come to the view that we either had to shut down Toronto or shut down the world. This issue was also starkly posed again by novelist Javier Marias. Speaking of a corrupt South American government, one of his characters says, "But then, what government isn't a thieving government? They handle far too much money and are more like businesses than governments, and businessmen want their profits." This is the conservative, socialist Canadian nightmare. That the government that was to protect us from dynamic but necessarily amoral commercial interests had itself become a profit center with an enormous stake in the fossil fuel industry. So this Canadian tradition of conservative political theology valued the past over progress and government intervention over an unregulated marketplace. They also valued the commons over the privately owned. In 1984, the Canadian scholar Joan Lockwood O'Donovan published her PhD thesis under the title George Grant and the Twilight of Justice. At several points in the book, she notes Grant's anxiety about what was happening to the natural environment. In an essay of her own, published originally in 1998 in Modern Theology, she made reference to what she called the gathering clouds of ecological disaster. The paper was titled Christian Platonism and Non-Proprietary Community. Leaning on this work of Joan O'Donovan's, Michael Northcott believes that Christians after the Middle Ages had lost their sense that nature had something akin to a soul. If it is merely a thing, then everything on it and in it is available for human consumption. Then he writes, the metaphysical ground is laid for the subsequent recovery of the Roman account of absolute ownership and the rise of private property as the dominant institution in human nature relations after the Reformation. According to the great philosopher John Locke, the land can only be redeemed from the curse of original sin by being made productive, and land is most productive when privately owned, and not when, for example, indigenous peoples use land in common property regimes. By contrast, Northcott argues, for the Hebrews, God had conferred creation on all persons. For her part, O'Donovan notes that in 1329, Pope John XXII proposed that from the moment of creation, humanity had full ownership of earthly goods in the same way that God had ownership of these goods. Prior to this, Christians had believed that ownership of earthly goods was a remedial institution only, meaning that it was allowed as the result of the fall into sin in the same way that the state was authorized to use coercive force in order to restrict the evil use of coercive force. Both were known to participate in the evil they were intended to curtail. Thus, they were both relative institutions governed in practice by Christ's counsels of perfection. In short, Overturning this prior consensus, this papal move resulted in an alienating transfer of lordship from God the Creator to man the manipulator. Bonaventure and John Wycliffe both, Lockwood argues, resisted this papal move. They considered humankind's natural and Christological lordship over the rest of creation to be primarily one of contemplative enjoyment rather than creative work, of losing our wills in delight at the non-human creation rather than of imposing them in the physical transformation through labor and technology. Wycliffe did not even like the word stewardship with respect to the natural world because he thought it attributed too much initiative to a humanity that could not be trusted with it. To give you another example, in the ancient church, when Gregory of Nyssa mounted his argument against slavery, he said that since in buying a slave, you have to buy all his or her possessions, therefore no one can afford to buy a slave because every human being owns the whole of creation. Yet another example, on the other side of Pope John's decree. At the time of the English Reformation, William Tyndale, the great Bible translator, who was burned at the stake during the reign of Henry VIII, a preacher who was horrified at the way poor people were being driven from the land because of enclosures and inflationary rents, made this same point. The doctrine of justification by grace alone only makes sense, he argues, because in Jesus Christ all plenteousness of God is to be found. Christ wants nothing of ours, and even our faith is his gift. Christ is all sufficient, and from that overflowing and absolute endless perfection of love comes a grace without let or hindrance. Our good works have nowhere to go. Christ does not need them, and it's possible that God does not want them. And since they have nowhere to go, no upward place to go, they have to go to your neighbor. That's where they belong. And not only must our good works include, he says very specifically, include the giving of good work to those who have no work. But beyond that, our works of mercy must even be extended to infidels because, quote, they have as good right in thy goods as thou thyself, because love maketh all things common. This politics of grace was what Rowan Williams calls Tyndale's vision for a fully cooperative society. Now, in making some room for a highly qualified doctrine of private ownership, the ancient Christians made a distinction between divisible and indivisible goods. Divisible goods are things like food, clothing, and housing, like your shoes. You can and probably should hide your shoes from the rest of us. They're yours and we don't want them. They're divisible. But indivisible goods include sunshine, wind, and rain. In the High Middle Ages, it was still the case that the management of divisible goods was modeled on the use of non-divisible goods. The use of non-divisible goods was normative. Divisible goods were relative. In modernity, Northcott points out, we attempt to model access rights and use rights of shared goods, like climate, oceans, and rivers, on the property ownership model of divisible goods. We still have the same basic concepts in play. The ancients are still with us. Their debates are still with us. We are using the same ideas. You know that you can own your car in a way that you cannot own a lake, because you can't control the water that goes from the lake into the river through other people's property. But we have inverted the order of importance so that the private tells us how to treat the common rather than the common telling us how to treat the private. What if the medievals had it right? They didn't say you couldn't own private property. They just said it was a danger to your soul. We have the same basic concepts in play, but we've reversed the order of priority. Like the European enclosures and the conquest of the Americas, modernity's assault on the air we breathe, the skies we look at, and the atmosphere we depend upon is, as Tyndall would say, theft and murder. This deification of private property was aided by an even earlier decision articulated in the condemnations of Paris in 1277. The bishop of that city, with archiepiscopal support from Canterbury, made a series of pronouncements that significantly changed the direction of Western history. In short, the view of St. Thomas Aquinas that the creation was an ordered and coherent whole because it somehow originated in and was disclosive of the mind of God and was thus a fitting subject for human contemplation was overturned. Arguing that God's will was the source of creation, not God's mind, and that that will was absolute and arbitrary, the condemnations at least created room for the notion that the created order is not really ordered at all, but is just an arbitrary collection of individual things, a doctrine called nominalism. And if God can arbitrarily act on an arbitrarily ordered creation, why can't humans? This notion of the arbitrary sovereign will of God was so important at the time that later the philosopher Descartes would even say, and by the way, it was related to the doctrine of parallel universes. God could make all kinds of universes, and they would all be different. And there are philosophers today who still treat this as a serious philosophical concept. Now, Descartes said that in a parallel universe, it would be possible for God to have made it in such a way that 2 + 3 did not equal 5, but equaled something else. Now, it seems to me, although I don't know that anybody has pointed this out, but if you take that kind of a view of God's arbitrary, sovereign, elective will, and it has no rhyme or reason, and that in parallel universes anything can happen, then I imagine that the killing of 6 million Jews in concentration camps would be perfectly acceptable in such a parallel universe. We have so come to believe that God is absolutely all-powerful, omnipotent, and arbitrary that were we to imagine that we could send God to the bleachers for a while and didn't have to think about him or worry about him, then we would be free to do what we imagine he did, which was simply to dominate and to have mastery over the created world and to treat it in any way that we wanted to, that we would be free even over human nature, that we could make ourselves to be whatever we wanted to be. We are indeed like gods. This notion that God had arbitrarily created a disordered universe, so to speak, leaves us with the notion that we are free to experiment with and to manipulate a more or less random natural world. Then add that to belief in the absolute human right to private property, and we're pretty secure in the knowledge that we are in charge here. My final point, and this will be quite brief. This conservative Canadian tradition thought that the land as common was more important than the land as private. The older view held, the ancient view, and the one that these Canadian conservatives still held to, the older view held that private property was limited to divisible things and was a remedial institution at best. So I turn now to the fourth of these concepts in political theology, to the question as to whether land is a divisible or an indivisible reality. Sounding themes that occupied George Grant, Oliver O'Donovan, another theologian in this conservative tradition, made this melancholy assertion in the introduction to his Bampton lecture delivered in 2003 in Oxford. We must face, he said, the evidence of long-term ecological crisis. The master narrative that was to have delivered us the crown of civilization has delivered us insuperable dangers. Part of the ecological crisis is, to quote the title of another of his essays, the loss of a sense of place. In this paper, Oliver O'Donovan points out that land is a composite reality. If you say that land can be privately owned, have you said something about the land, or have you said something about the nature of private ownership? How limited and relative must private ownership really be if you can imagine that land could be one of the things you could privately own? For he says you can exclude the public from the land that you privately own, but you cannot exclude the land that you privately own from the public, as your land is that place through and around which the rest of the human community must pass, no matter who owns it. O'Donovan says you can't take your land out of the public in the way you can take your name out of the phone book. You can't make it go away. He writes, to view land as a convertible resource is to ignore the primordial relationship which any human community has to its physical environment. By focusing exclusively on the productive relationship, the economic analysis carries political thought to a dangerous level of abstraction. For those wanting a better understanding of the problem of land ownership, O'Donovan recommends reading a book by Vine Deloria Jr. and Little, The Nation Within, The Past and Future of American Indian Sovereignty. Most of us have become accustomed to thinking that many of these ancient and medieval concerns, many of these biblical concerns, in fact, about private property, about the common ownership of land and the evils of usury, and yes, even the evils of mining, are all ideals from the past that have long since been superseded. It is just not practical. And here is the question. Do you think this is practical? Seriously? It's time to go back and relook at some things we thought were not possible. Because what we are doing is not possible any longer. But the worst use of this idea of private ownership of land does not come into it. So O'Donovan is demonstrating, showing us, I think, that this idea of the common ownership of the land, it's still a relevant idea. It's not as if it was biblical. It's not as if it existed from the beginning of the world. Its worst use does not happen until the 18th century. People in Europe owned land commonly for centuries, and in some places still do. Even in Manitoba, there are common pastures. And I think O'Donovan is hinting at the fact that if Aboriginal thinkers are still arguing that the common ownership of land is essential to their well-being, then it is still an open question. It has not, in fact, been closed. It is a legitimately open question. What does private ownership mean? And can you possibly privately own land? Or does it belong to all of us? But I want to conclude this talk by connecting the idea of land with the idea of homelessness. Just briefly, in the work of Simone Weil, the Jewish Catholic mystic who had such a deep impact on George Grant and on the O'Donovans, and in Hannah Arendt, a Jewish woman who twice barely escaped the German authorities just before and during the Second World War. Writing for the Free French Resistance toward the end of her life in 1943, Simone Weil predicted, and this is extraordinary, I think, and I assume that George Grant had read this and pondered it. In 1943, Simone Weil predicted that
it's your choice, but it doesn't have to lead to passivity, but it often does. That would be my take.
And I hope I didn't say anything that suggested that the Christian community should be passive in the face of this crisis. And in particular, that's why I want to raise the question of climate refugees. I mean, there's multiple people in this room tonight who know far, far more about that than I do. I'm merely here to say that from the reading that I've done and my perspective on history is simply to issue a warning, and that is the churches will need to know what they believe and where they stand on the issue of climate refugees. And we will need to know it and figure it out sooner rather than later. because I'm not convinced that our governments or larger communities will agree with the stance that we will end up taking. And that's why I think that Hannah Arendt's book on totalitarianism is so incredibly important, especially the third part, the third volume in that 3-volume work. Because what she's saying in her book, I think, is totalitarianism was not a political concept that ever existed before the 20th century. It wasn't one of the items that we had available to us. But we figured it out in the 20th century. And now that we've figured it out, it can be redone. And one of the reasons why the church should attend to her book is because it goes into incredible detail about how you build a totalitarian society. Like, she almost gives you a roadmap. This is how you would do it. She talks very specifically and concretely and incredibly fine-grained analysis about what a one-party state looks like, for example, and how that political party should operate, and how it should have insiders and outsiders, and how they relate to each other. She just goes on and on and on explaining what the playbook is. And she's terribly afraid that mass human migration in the 21st century will invite back this kind of totalitarianism. Because we're going to be so terrified of the chaos. So I think that the Christian church should be ready for this. And I don't want to be unnecessarily alarmist. I'm not saying it's going to happen or that it will happen in Canada. I just think that we should go back and reread the Barmen Declaration of Faith and think carefully about where we're going to stand as churches. So that's one part of an answer to what you had to say. I also think that there Catholic priests have experience now in the Philippines and other places in Southeast Asia with people suffering from climate hurricanes, climate change-related catastrophic weather events. And one of the things they have found is that there is an apocalyptic way of thinking, Christian apocalyptic hope, that actually does energize people. They come home to devastated villages and decimated. They've lost children and wives and husbands. It's horrifying what they live through. And yet they go to church and they say their prayers and they somehow say, we are faithful people, and we're not giving. We are in unbelievable grief, but we will not give up because God is faithful. So there is some scientific research even to suggest that there's a kind of Christian apocalyptic thinking that actually does energize people and keep them going. And one of the things I think that's curious about a sound apocalyptic theology, biblical apocalyptic liturgy, is often that when the writer is talking about the end of the world, what they're actually talking about is the other side of the end of the world event. They actually don't stop where you would expect them to stop, but somehow it's a way of casting their hope into a future which it now looks as if would not be possible for us. There's a sense in which to think, I don't know what you think of this, I'm just making this up, but I wonder if there's a healthy way of thinking about the apocalyptic that makes the apocalyptic never happen.
And in fact, the notion of end is to be understood in the teleological sense.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We're talking about the goal of God's redemptive work that drives Christian apocalyptic thinking.
Right.
It's not termination of something.
Yes,
so this
exactly.
is very critical
Yeah.
to distinguish.
Mark had a question. Let's take one or two more and we won't go. Mark, in the middle there.
Thank you. Well, a brief comment and a slightly longer one. There was a time and a culture in which the notion that radical innovation might substantively improve our lot, and that was the Garden of Eden. And much of what happened in the Enlightenment is kind of a recapitulation of that, and it's out of that that modernity sprung. So here's the second comment. Reverend Widdicombe, you spoke about the notion of churches perhaps calling for government intervention, and this comment is not to dismiss the notion that the church cannot wisely and innocently engage, shall we say, secular powers. But if we do so, granted that we have been complicit and careless and culpable in our complicity with the capitalist side of the material or the materialist perspective, we need to be equally cautious about complicity in the equally materialist, socialist, and government interventionist side of things. It's not to say that we shouldn't think carefully about it and grapple with it, but I don't think that government is what we can put, the basket we can put all our eggs in.
Yes, well, again, George Grant and Stephen Leacock would say you certainly can't trust a Liberal government. And I don't mean that to be taken seriously. I simply mean that they were not suggesting that government as such could always be trusted. They were arguing that it can't always be trusted. I think what they were saying, though, is that human governments do have responsibilities and powers that only they have. And when they refuse to take their responsibilities seriously, the people who suffer will be the poor. If Michael Northcott is right, then what needs to happen almost immediately is that national governments legislate against the extraction of fossil fuels. Because there's no reason to take the coal out of the ground if you don't plan to sell it to somebody who's going to burn it. And that's where the divisible and indivisible property things becomes relevant, I think. Coal can be privately owned. It's a divisible thing. But the climate is indivisible. So if governments will not appropriately legislate the interface between the indivisible and the divisible, where are we? And I think that many people are hoping that the fossil fuel industry will someday realize that it too will go out of business if the worst comes to pass. And so we'll be okay. At the very last minute, they'll figure out that this climate change is bad for business. Now, I think there are lots of Christian people in business who know very well that climate change is bad for business. And they are terribly worried about it, as are the rest of us. I was a little embarrassed at the degree to which Grant and Leacock both go after business in the quotations that I was offering you, because I think it presented a slightly unfair perspective. But I think Stephen Leacock would say, do not ever believe that the fossil fuel industry will at the last minute wake up and save us all. Like, for example, what if they miscalculate? Number one. Number two, what happens if there are people, organizations like international fossil fuel industries that are being led by people who think it's already too late? What motive would they have for shutting down? I think what Michael Northcott is saying to us is, you don't know what's going on out there. We don't really know who's in charge. Neoliberal, global, freelance, kind of a buccaneer capitalism is out of control. And if our national governments won't help us to bring it back so that reasonable people can understand what's going on and have some say about it, then we're going to pay a horrible price. So yeah, government isn't perfect, but governments can do some things that nobody else can.
Maybe time is, we've been here a while. If I can just pose one question. Bonhoeffer speaks about the blessing of bearing. and I guess what I hear tonight, there's a lot of things I've heard tonight, but one of the things is the inevitability of suffering. And what does it mean for us Christians to suffer Christianly? And then how do we prepare for that? I just want to, from a pastoral or even a spiritual mentor kind of position, if either of you want to comment to us about, to make it personal, my father died this summer. Someone asked me if he was coming, how are you preparing for it? I went, I don't know. If this is coming, and if we want to respond Christianly to suffering, what do we do now to prepare?
Yes, well, that comes back to the question of pastoral care, and this is where I think that pastors and priests and lay leaders of congregations are going to need to rely on the faculty of CMU to help us think this through. Because there's going to be lots of ways to get this one wrong. However, again, I have not thought this through. I am not satisfied yet with the conclusions that I have come to, but I can point you maybe in a couple of directions. George Grant said at the end of his life, when people accused him of being a pessimist, he said, I've never said that people don't need to be courageous. So I think that especially for young people, I think one of the, if you listen to scientists or writers talk about this, you might notice that they're using their scientific curiosity or their writing skills as a way to buffer them from the message they're delivering to you. The world is ending. Isn't that fascinating? Right? The scientist has a personal interest in trying to think through what that really means. Writers who write about social catastrophe are very good writers, and they keep on writing. And I think they use their writing as a way to buffer them from the sheer madness of what they're suggesting to us. And I think especially teenagers need the same kind of buffering. So one reason they're on the streets, I think, is it empowers them. They have something to do, and there's hope, and it can be a buffer. I think that thinking theologically about these issues can be a buffer. It's something constructive to do. So that's one thing. But I also think that people like C.S. Lewis and Wendell Berry can be extremely helpful to us because, just to take two examples, but those are two Christian writers who are willing unflinchingly to look at the worst that could possibly happen to human beings, which in their minds might not necessarily be climate catastrophe, right? But their counsel, like C.S. Lewis says, you should go and read a sermon that Lewis wrote in 1939, in the fall of 1939, after war had been declared, to students in the University of Oxford, in which he told them, keep on studying geography and mathematics and all of the other things that you're studying. It makes sense to keep doing what you've always been doing. Do your duty. You may be called up to war and you may not come home. But in the meantime, we should do the tasks that God has given us to do. And he has another essay called The World's Last Night, which is based on John Donne's poem. And there he says that in the face of calamity, frantic panaceas to save the world are not what's called for. But he said, sound and reasonable good work for the future, that's good to do. So he said, if your job was to feed the pigs, then on the last night you should be found feeding the pigs. Well, Wendell Berry, I think in his book, The Art of Loading Brush, where he talks about climate change, has something of the same sort of hard-nosed Christian realism about him. And he sort of says, look, the world was going to end sometime. So I'm just going to go home and keep on working and doing good things in my neighborhood for the environment and for my farm. I'm just going to keep going. Panic is not going to be the solution. Fear is not going to be the solution. So I guess I would say, especially to Christian young people, is Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And climate change does not change the gospel. God loves us.
Thank you. Just a couple of announcements and we'll let you go. Terry, want to go first here?
A very quick segue. You may or not be aware that there is an art gallery on the CMU campus. It's just across 50 meters over there. This Friday at 7:30 p.m. a new exhibition will be opened, and it is called Changing World, a dialogue on conservation. In different ways, 6 very different artists work to depict beauty and grief and the complex relationships that they see between their mediums and the changes that they're witnessing in the plants, the animals, the created world that they love. I encourage you to be attentive to that and to check out the gallery.
My name is Don Betts, and I'm working with St. Margaret's on their upcoming consultation on climate change and the theopolitical imagination. Just to draw your attention to this, which you may have found on your seat. If you didn't find one of these on your seat, I do have some at the back table by the bookstore. Just a quick advertisement for the consultation coming up next September. On the back, you'll find a short bibliography of David's lecture. A full bibliography is on our website, stmargaretsconsultation.ca/resources. If you'd like to know more about the consultation, as we sort of gather, we're in the very early stages of it. If you want to know more about it, as we get further in, there's two ways you can do that. One is just write your name on this in your email, tear it off, throw it in the bowl over there. And the other way is to simply go to the website and you can sign up for our mailing list there. Thank you.
Okay, if I could put a plug in it too. This is the book that everybody's been talking about tonight. Michael Northcott, Political Theology of Climate Change. If you look at mine, it's half read, which is pretty much what everybody's looks like when they buy it. It's a bit of a tough read, and I will get through it. It's a bit of a slog, but even I can get some of it, it's quite actually wonderful. It's just not the easiest read. Is what I'm saying. Other contributors there were going to be Norman Wurzba, who I just finished doing a retreat with in the States. Marvelous. He works with Wendell Berry. He edits his books. He's a guy that writes on soil. Soil is the site of resurrection, he says. Soil is redeemed death. He's a guy full of that kind of language, and he's really wonderful. Mark MacDonald, of course, is the National Indigenous Anglican Archbishop. There'll be others as well. It'll be a great consultation. I have to get used to that word for that. So we hope to see you. I think is that all? We've covered everything? Why don't you just stand for a minute? I'll sing over you here. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, as it is in heaven, as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our transgressions, as we forgive transgressors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. 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 Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.